If you follow technology or, national security, you probably have this feeling that we are just constantly losing the cybersecurity battle.
Oh, absolutely. It feels like a perpetual game of digital whack-a-mole.
Exactly. We're always chasing emergency patches. There's another data breach headline every year, and it feels like our entire digital world is built on something fundamentally fragile.
And that feeling, it's being validated at the very highest levels of U.S. cyber defense. We're here today to unpack a really radical, almost game-changing thesis coming from the leaders at CISA.
CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency.
Right. And their core message is this: America doesn't actually have a cybersecurity problem.
Okay, that's a bold statement.
It is. They say what we have is a fundamental systemic software quality problem.
That is a crucial distinction because it totally reframes where the effort should go, where the money should go.
Mm.
We're not talking about just bolting on more expensive firewalls after the fact. We're talking about fixing the raw materials, the code itself, right at the source.
Exactly. So our mission for this deep dive is to really analyze the scope of this strategic shift. This is a deliberate, a wholesale systemic reorientation of national security strategy. It moves the entire focus from defense to design.
And the stakes here could not be higher, especially when you look at the current threat environment. So we have three major areas to focus on today.
Okay.
First, we have to get into the economic root cause of why software is so insecure, and then CISA's big solution,
Okay.
shifting to a mandatory liability regime.
And second, we'll break down how they're implementing Secure by Design, or SPD. And this isn't just some, vague idea. It's a concrete roadmap with some pretty surprising mandates. We're talking about targeting everything from core programming languages like C and C++ to what's being taught in university computer science programs.
And finally, and this is the urgent part, we have to look at the immediate threat that's making this whole overhaul necessary. We're going to detail exactly how Chinese state-sponsored actors, a group called Volt Typhoon, are pre-positioning themselves inside U.S. critical infrastructure.
Creating a truly catastrophic threat. And to frame this whole thing, CISA's leadership has adopted this incredibly powerful analogy. They argue that we're currently living in the before seatbelts era of software.
The before seatbelts era.
Yeah, they draw a direct line to Ralph Nader's 1965 book, Unsafe at Any Speed.
Right, which exposed how car companies were prioritizing style and profit over human life. They were building cars with, frankly, unnecessary dangers built right in.
Yeah.
And we've just accepted that software should ship with defects.
Mm.
Imagine applying that same Nader critique to your digital life. We're constantly being blamed for crashing the car when the steering wheel was faulty from the start.
It's all about shifting the accountability. We have to go from blaming the digital driver, the user who didn't patch fast enough, to blaming the digital engineer who shipped the flaw in the first place.
Okay, let's unpack that. If we accept the premise that this is a software quality problem, let's jump straight in. Section 1. The root cause. Why have we, as a society, just normalized this for decades?
Well, the core assertion, right, is that software vulnerabilities are not some unavoidable cosmic fate. They're not all the result of these super sophisticated zero-day attacks.
They're just bugs.
They are fundamentally a product defect, and we have collectively normalized releasing technology to the market with dozens, hundreds, sometimes thousands of known exploitable defects.
That would be absolutely unthinkable in any other field.
Any other field where safety is at risk, like aerospace or construction. Imagine that.
I mean, if a company released a toaster that had a 1 in 10 chance of starting a house fire, they'd face immediate recalls, lawsuits, probably criminal investigations.
Of course.
But when an enterprise software company ships a product with 50 common vulnerabilities, we just call it Patch Tuesday and move on. It's the cost of doing business.
It is. It's what sociologists call the normalization of deviance. We just start accepting more and more risk right up until the inevitable breach happens. And then, historically, the tendency has been to blame the victim.
The consumer, the small business.
Right. For poor security habits, for not applying a patch quickly enough, or for misconfiguring some complex tool.
Which, again, just pushes the responsibility downstream. The manufacturer makes a flawed product, but the consumer, who doesn't have the resources or the expertise, gets blamed for the crash.
And CISA is trying to completely flip that script. They argue we need to stop asking, why didn't the user update their software? And start asking, why did the manufacturer produce technology that needed so many critical patches in the first place?
We're misplacing the blame.
Completely. We are compounding the original design failure with a total lack of accountability for the vendor.
So let's move beyond the analogies. What's the hard technical proof that these aren't just sophisticated new attacks, but old preventable defects that just keep coming back?
We have the receipts on this, and the data is, frankly, damning. You can look all the way back to 2007.
Yeah.
An organization called MITRE identified 13 specific software defects they called unforgivable.
Unforgivable.
Unforgivable. These weren't exotic things. They were basic engineering failures that should have been eliminated by then. They were the digital equivalent of faulty brakes, just preventable errors.
Okay, that was almost 2 decades ago. Surely with all the money and focus on security since then, we've rooted those out of modern code.
You would think so.
Mm.
But astonishingly, no. A shocking 10 of those original 13 unforgivable defects are still on MITRE's 2024 CWE Top 25 Most Dangerous Software Weaknesses.
Still there, after all this time.
It's still there. This points to a systemic, institutional failure in engineering that spans generations of developers. And we're not talking about obscure flaws. We're talking about things like memory-unsafe code and SQL injection vulnerabilities that are both widespread and notoriously easy for bad guys to exploit.
The fact that they persist, that the same 10 defects have haunted us for decades, that points directly back to the economics of the problem, doesn't it?
It has to.
If engineers know how to fix them, why do vendors keep shipping products full of them?
This is where CISA brings in market economics to explain the failure. Security, in their model, is what's known as a credence good.
A credence good. Okay, let's unpack that term. Why is that the root of the issue?
So in economics, a credence good is a product or a service where it's almost impossible for the customer to verify the quality even after they've bought it and used it.
Okay.
So if you buy a new app, you can't tell just by using the search function or, enjoying the user interface whether the code underneath is written safely or dangerously. The security is invisible to you.
So if the security is the unseen benefit.
Exactly. The vendor is economically incentivized to deprioritize that unseen benefit security in favor of new features. Features are tangible. They drive sales, they drive market share. Security. Well, security just reduces some future abstract risk.
So in a competitive market, a vendor who spends the extra time and money to eliminate those 10 MIRE defects is actually at a disadvantage.
A huge disadvantage against a competitor who just rushes to market with a flashier new feature, but ignores the security underneath.
That's the market failure. The short-term incentives just overwhelm the long-term collective good.
That's it. If security doesn't pay the bills this quarter, then systemic underinvestment becomes the rational business choice. And that's why those predictable defects have persisted for 20 years.
And the consequence of this decades-long economic failure isn't just an IT problem, it's a national security liability.
Absolutely. When you see how deeply private companies, utilities, hospitals, all our critical infrastructure is integrated into our digital world, these flawed, defective products become major attack vectors for foreign adversaries.
So when a private power utility gets compromised because of a cheap, defective component from a major vendor,
That is no longer just an expensive cleanup.
Yeah.
That's a direct threat to the resilience and the stability of the entire nation.
which brings us squarely to the policy solutions CISA is pushing for so aggressively, mandating accountability through a liability regime.
This is the strategic crux of the whole thing. The core idea is shifting the financial and the legal burden. CISA is arguing that the risk has to be rebalanced away from the small organizations and the consumers.
The ones least able to defend themselves.
Exactly. And onto the major technology manufacturers who are much, much better equipped to manage that risk in the design phase.
It's about correcting that market failure we just talked about by changing the financial equation for the manufacturer.
Precisely. And CISA leaders constantly go back to the automotive precedent. Conventional wisdom used to be that if you crashed your car, it was your fault. End of story.
But that whole narrative changed once we realized that inherent design flaws, like a fuel tank that was guaranteed to explode in a fender bender, were the real root cause, regardless of what the driver did.
And that change led to profound legal and economic accountability. The liability for defective auto parts now rests with the producer. I mean, a tragic but really clear example is the litigation against the Takata Corporation for their defective airbags.
Right, the airbags that would explode, they killed over 30 people and injured hundreds.
Exactly. The driver might have been in a minor collision, which was their fault, but the catastrophic failure, the explosion and death, that was caused by the product defect. And in that case, the producer, Takata, was held liable for billions.
So the goal is to establish a similar legal path for software.
That's the goal. If a preventable, Decades-old vulnerability leads to a catastrophic breach. The manufacturer should face the consequences, not just the victim who failed to patch.
Now, the industry's biggest pushback, I imagine, is that this kind of liability regime would just crush small software startups. They operate on razor-thin margins. How can they afford the massive compliance costs to meet some national standard of care?
That is a critical point, and it's the most common counterargument. CISA acknowledges this. Innovation is vital. The legal architecture can't be purely punitive. It has to incentivize reasonable risk reduction.
A balancing act.
A very careful balancing act. And that's why CISA is urging Congress to establish three critical pillars for this.
Okay, let's look at those three pillars. It starts with the standard of care.
Right. The first pillar is the standard of care, or SAW. This is the legal threshold. It moves beyond these vague expectations like just be secure to requiring adherence to defined verifiable security practices.
A measurable standard.
A measurable standard. This might mean mandatory penetration testing or mandatory transition to memory-safe languages for new code. It creates a defined bar for what reasonable security looks like.
That sounds like a heavy lift, but it provides clarity. So the second pillar, the safe harbor provision, that must be the offset to protect the companies that are actually trying.
Precisely. The second pillar is safe harbor provisions. This is essential to prevent the liability from just crushing innovation. It grants legal protection to companies that can demonstrate they meet or exceed that measurable standard of care.
So if you do everything right and still get hit by some brand new, novel attack.
You're shielded from liability. It rewards proactive diligence. It balances accountability with the need for innovation.
And the third pillar attacks the legal loophole we all click through every day, the EULA.
The end user license agreement.
Correct.
The third pillar is an anti-disclaimer clause. CISA wants legislation that would prevent tech manufacturers from using those contracts to disclaim liability for their own defective products.
Right, the fine print that says, we're not responsible for any damages.
Exactly. An anti-disclaimer clause would ensure that the manufacturer, the one best positioned to manage the risk, can't just legally offload responsibility for their own negligence.
So that's the shtick, the threat of liability. But the government also has a massive carrot, right? Its own purchasing power.
Oh, a huge carrot. And the Biden administration is using that right now as a powerful market driver without even waiting for Congress. They've established these stringent software security requirements for all federal contractors.
So if you want to sell software to the U.S. government,
You have to meet specific security standards. And that's a multi-billion-dollar market. It forces companies to change their practices if they want that business.
we're also seeing this push into the consumer world, trying to solve that credence good problem for everyday things.
Exactly. They're implementing security labels, like the CyberTrust mark, for connected consumer devices. Think webcams, smart fridges, baby monitors. This label gives a verifiable signal to the customer that the product was built with security in mind.
It makes security a visible feature.
A visible feature that consumers might actually be willing to pay more for, which creates a positive market incentive.
And that transition from policy to practice leads us right into Section 3. Secure by Design, or SBD, in practice. This is the operational roadmap CISA is pushing the entire industry to adopt. What's the core idea here?
Secure by Design, which they launched formally in April 2023, is the methodology that demands security be a priority at every stage of development, not just at the end.
So getting away from that bolt-on security approach.
Exactly. That reactive model created the multi-billion-dollar cybersecurity industry we have today. The principle of SBD is simple. Instead of playing whack-a-mole with individual bugs, let's eliminate entire classes of vulnerabilities through better engineering upfront.
This started as a voluntary thing. What kind of traction has it actually gotten in the tech industry?
The momentum has been pretty remarkable, actually. It suggests the industry knows the status quo is unsustainable. In May of 2024, CISA launched the formal SBD pledge.
And companies are signing up.
They've seen what they call a groundswell of support. It's grown to over 250 major companies who are committed to making measurable progress toward these SBD goals.
And it's not just U.S. companies.
No, it's global. 20 international partners, agencies, and governments around the world have also signed on. This is a global recognition that the old way isn't working.
So let's get into the biggest technical shift CISA is pushing for, under SBD memory safety. For those of us who aren't coders, why is this so fundamental? Why does it represent 2/3 of the entire problem?
Memory safety is. It's critical. It's all about how a program allocates and manages computer memory. And CISA estimates that about two-thirds of all known software vulnerabilities are related to memory safety issues. We're talking about classic flaws like buffer overflows.
Okay, give me an analogy for a buffer overflow.
All right, imagine you have a teacup, and in the code you define its capacity as, say, 8 ounces. But then the program gets fed 10 ounces of data or water. Older languages like C and C++ don't automatically check the size of the container, so that excess data overflows the teacup and spills into the memory space allocated for the next thing on the digital shelf. And that spill can corrupt data, or worse, allow an attacker to inject malicious code.
And C and C++ are the culprits because they were built for speed, not safety.
Exactly. They're powerful, but they are dangerously manual. They lack the built-in automated guardrails to prevent coders from making these mistakes. So the goal is a massive industry transition to what are called memory-safe languages.
Like Rust, Go, Python.
Right. Rust, Go, Python, C#, Java.
Yeah.
If we can migrate new development away from C and C++ autoful, two-thirds of this predictable, persistent vulnerability problem could, in theory, just disappear.
Astonishing figure. Two-thirds gone just by changing the tool. Do we have any real-world proof that this actually works?
We absolutely do, and it comes from one of the biggest code bases on the planet, Android. Google announced a huge milestone with Android 13. The majority of the new code added to that release was written in a memory-safe language, specifically Rust. And the result? They have found 0 memory safety vulnerabilities in that Rust code since it was released.
0. That's a concrete zero defect result.
It validates the entire strategy. It proves this can work at scale.
But that creates a massive challenge. The inertia is huge. How do you transition the entire existing engineering workforce, and maybe more importantly, the next generation of talent?
That is where CISA has issued this really direct and powerful call to action for universities. The first big step is what they call coursework migration.
So moving the core computer science curriculum away from languages that have been the standard for decades.
Yes, they're saying C and C++ should still be taught. You need them for legacy code,
Yeah.
but they should be explicitly treated as dangerous. The core programming instruction has to shift to memory-safe languages.
That's a huge challenge for academia.
It's massive. It means retraining faculty, rewriting textbooks, overhauling decades of investment.
What about security itself? Is it being taught like a foundational principle, like structural integrity for a civil engineer?
Right now, no. We're failing miserably at it. Think about this. Only one of the top 20 undergraduate computer science programs in the USUC San Diego actually requires a security course to graduate.
You've won. That's a huge gap.
It's a shocking gap. A software engineer can graduate without even understanding basic vulnerabilities. CISA is arguing that security must be woven throughout all computer science coursework. It has to be a core engineering competency, not some niche specialty.
We're just perpetuating the cycle of defects by sending graduates into the workforce who don't even know what a buffer overflow is.
Let alone how to prevent it. And beyond the curriculum, CISA is also targeting the open source ecosystem, which underpins almost all modern software. They're calling on universities to migrate their sponsored open source projects to memory-safe languages and to invest in research to make foundational open source components safer.
Now, all of this accountability, legal and technical, it requires transparency to work. What's CISA doing to force more transparency across the industry?
2 key things. First, they're expanding the number of CVE numbering authorities, or CNAs. This forces more manufacturers to publicly identify and assign standard IDs to vulnerabilities in their own products. It makes them own their flaws.
And the other big tool is the Software Bill of Materials, the SBOM.
SBOMs are vital for supply chain transparency. Think of an SBOM as the ingredients label on a food package, but for software. It's an inventory of all the open source components and libraries inside a program.
So you know what you're actually running.
Exactly. And when a new vulnerability like Log4j comes out, you can instantly check your SBOMs to see if you're affected, instead of waiting for your vendors to tell you.
We've even seen some private companies start demanding this from their own suppliers.
Dropbox is a great example. Back in 2019, they totally overhauled their vendor contracts. They now hold their vendors to the same strict security standards they use internally. Things like mandatory MFA, vulnerability disclosure policies. It shows the industry can lead on this through contract law.
Okay, now we have to shift our focus to Section 4, the critical infrastructure threat. All this talk about systemic remediation is urgent because the threat has fundamentally changed. We've moved beyond just espionage to adversaries setting up for destructive kinetic attacks.
That urgency is reflected in the government's formal policy. a new policy called National Security Memorandum 22, or NSM 22, that came out in April 2024. This is pivotal. It explicitly mandates that minimum security requirements be built into critical infrastructure upfront and by design.
So it formalizes the secure by design philosophy at the highest level of government for our most vital systems.
It does. And it formalizes CISA's central role. As the national coordinator, CISA is now mandated to lead a whole-of-government effort to mitigate these cross-sector risks. And this covers all 16 critical infrastructure sectors: energy, water, communications, transportation, all of it.
Let's focus on the specific adversary CISA is most worried about right now, Volt Typhoon. This is the Chinese state-sponsored group operating deep inside U.S. systems. What is their goal?
Volt Typhoon's objectives are, frankly, terrifying, because they aren't primarily about stealing intellectual property. Their goal is to achieve and maintain long-term, persistent access to U.S. critical infrastructure.
Long-term.
In some cases, they've been observed in victim networks for 5 years or more, and they're targeting systems that support military mobilization, port operations, transportation systems, and critically, water and wastewater systems.
And what makes them so dangerous is their stealth. They're not using big, loud malware that's easy to spot.
Exactly. Their whole strategy relies on living off the land, or LOTL techniques. It's a masterclass in stealth. They use native system tools that are already on the network and trusted PowerShell, WMIC, legitimate remote access tools.
So their malicious activity just blends in with normal network traffic.
It blends in perfectly.
Yeah.
And they use valid, stolen accounts to move around. They just look like another system administrator.
Okay, so walk us through their ultimate goal here. Gaining full domain compromise. This is where they get the keys to the entire kingdom.
That's their endgame. They move laterally until they can compromise the domain controllers, the central brain of the network, and they extract the entire Active Directory database. It's a file called ntds.ddtus.
And that file contains what?
Everything. All the user accounts, security groups, and critically, the hashed passwords for every single user and service account on the network.
So they've stolen the master keyring for the entire organization, but that file is always locked by the operating system, right?
It is. So this is where their sophistication comes in. They use a legitimate Windows backup feature called the Volume Shadow Copy Service, or VSS. It creates a point-in-time snapshot of the disk. They can then pull the ntds.edet file from that inert snapshot, bypassing the live file lock.
That's ingenious and terrifying. And once they have the password hashes...
They don't try to crack them on the victim's network. That's too noisy. They exfiltrate the file and use powerful offline cracking techniques. This gives them persistent high-level credentials for administrators across the network. And with those credentials, they start pivoting toward the operational technology, the OT systems.
Meaning they're moving from the corporate IT side email and files to the systems that control physical things.
Precisely. They've been seen testing access to OT assets. They have the capability to manipulate HVAC controls, to disrupt energy distribution, to mess with water controls. They are establishing the ability to flip the lights off, shut the water down, or cause real physical damage.
This sounds like they're preparing for a full-on conflict. What is the explicit catastrophic risk CISA is planning for?
CISA is planning for the scenario where a major geopolitical crisis, a conflict abroad involving the U.S., would be coupled with coordinated destructive cyber attacks here on the U.S. homeland. They see this as a strategic certainty, not a possibility.
And what are the forecasted consequences of an attack like that?
CISA leadership has been very blunt about this to make sure policymakers get it. They're talking about the potential explosion of multiple U.S. gas pipelines, mass pollution of water systems, a hijacking of telecommunications, and crippling our transportation nodes like ports and railways.
And the strategic goal isn't just random destruction.
No, it's profoundly political and military. First, to incite chaos and panic across the country. And second, critically, to deter and slow down our ability to marshal our military might in response to the conflict overseas.
If the homeland is crippled, it slows down deployment.
Exactly. This is why software quality and critical infrastructure resilience are now absolutely inseparable from U.S. military readiness.
Which brings us to Section 5, where we look at how CISA is trying to operationalize this strategy while navigating its unique and often difficult position in the government.
CISA's mandate is very unusual. It's America's cyber defense agency and national coordinator for CI, but it is purposefully not military, not regulatory, and not an intelligence agency in its approach.
That must define its whole culture.
It does. Their mantra is Everything we do is by, with, and through partners. They have to lead with influence and expertise, relying on trust and collaboration, not the heavy hand of a regulator.
So given they can't be everywhere, where are they focusing their limited resources?
They're focused on what they call the target-rich, cyber-poor. These are the organizations that are critical but are completely resource-constrained. We're talking about local hospitals, school districts, small municipal water utilities.
Right. The U.S. water sector alone has over 150,000 distinct utilities.
And many of them are tiny. They lack any dedicated cybersecurity staff. They can't afford a CSO or a multi-million-dollar security stack. So CISA provides essential free services.
Like vulnerability scanning?
Right. Cyber hygiene assessments, vulnerability scanning, even physical security assessments. And crucially, they are building out a nationwide field force of hundreds of advisors. They're building boots on the ground.
So what does a CISA field advisor actually do? It sounds like they're creating a tech support army for critical infrastructure.
That's a good way to put it. The field force is essential because CISA doesn't want to just send a report that says, here are your 50 problems, good luck. The field advisors provide hands-on support. They help these small organizations prioritize fixes, find resources, and actually implement the solutions. They bridge the gap.
And collaboration has to happen in real time, especially against a threat like Volt Typhoon. How is CISA making that happen between government and the private sector?
That is the entire purpose of the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative, or JCDC, which they set up in August 2021. This is a game changer. It's the only entity in law mandated to bring CISA, the FBI, NSA, Cyber Command, and the DoD together on one platform.
And it includes the private sector, who actually sees most of the attacks.
It now has over 200 companies, cloud providers, software vendors, infrastructure owners, and they use things like dedicated Slack channels for real-time, frictionless information sharing. They can build a defense plan in hours, not weeks. They even have specialized groups for industrial control systems and for generative AI.
And the emphasis has clearly shifted to being proactive, catching the bad guys before they can attack.
That's the measure of success now. And it's encapsulated in their pre-ransomware notification initiative. This is a huge deal. CISA uses tips and intelligence, often from the ethical hacking community, to find ransomware actors already inside critical infrastructure networks before they deploy the malware.
So they can warn the victim ahead of time.
They can notify the victim, sometimes days in advance, and help them kick the criminals out, preventing that worst-day scenario.
And to make all this policy work, the government needs good data. That's where mandatory reporting comes in.
That's the function of CIRCIA, the Cyber Incident Reporting for Critical Infrastructure Act. Mandatory reporting gives the federal government the aggregated, anonymized data it needs to actually understand the scope of the problem. CIRCIA's role is to coordinate that data so entities aren't buried in redundant paperwork and use it purely for cyber defense.
Okay, now we have to address the political reality hanging over this entire strategy. CISA has grown massively in its role, its budget, its authority, but the execution of this grand plan faces significant instability at the very top.
That is the massive uncertainty. CISA was established in 2018. After huge incidents like SolarWinds, the agency just exploded. They hired over 2,100 people, grew to 3,400 total, with a budget near $3 billion. They became indispensable.
But our sources point to a recent, very aggressive government downsizing campaign, particularly in the lead up to and during the change in administration. And CISA seems to have suffered a pretty unprecedented loss of expertise.
Yes. The reports from May 2025 indicated what was essentially a decapitation of leadership. CISA lost almost all of its top officials, the experienced leaders of its operating divisions, its regional offices, its key policy people. These were the very experts driving the Secure by Design strategy and running the JCDC collaborations.
And losing that amount of mission-critical talent, especially with rising threats from Volt Typhoon and rampant ransomware, that has to threaten the entire strategy. You can't implement a complex liability regime without experienced hands at the top.
It creates immense operational challenges. It injects a dangerous level of precarity into the Secure by Design movement. You're asking an entire industry to make huge technical and financial investments based on CISA's direction.
But that direction is threatened if the agency itself lacks stable leadership.
Exactly. Now, despite this political shift, the remaining CISA leadership has maintained that the mission protecting critical infrastructure, reducing risk to Americans, is nonpartisan and should be valued for what it is: national security.
And yet the reality is that an agency's strength is its people. Replacing that level of expertise isn't something you can do quickly. It adds this huge layer of urgency to the whole SPD movement. They have to institutionalize these changes rapidly before political instability can derail the whole thing.
It basically turns the fight for software quality into a race against the political clock.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, let's just reinforce how monumental this shift really is. The U.S. is moving its entire cyber strategy from a reactive model of bolting on security to demanding safety be designed in from the very beginning.
And it's driven by economic accountability, that liability regime, and this profound awareness that adversaries like Volt Typhoon are trying to cripple our infrastructure for geopolitical gain.
This whole reorientation demands that manufacturers finally internalize the cost of security.
Right, using modern engineering, modern tools like memory-safe languages. It's about proactive defense against the next major conflict. It's the required shift from that unsafe at any speed era of software to just demanding safety by default.
But there is one massive long-term challenge that policies like Secure by Design, which focus on new code, don't really address. And it's just looming over everything we've talked about.
And that challenge is technical debt. We have decades of legacy, insecure software underpinning nearly all of our critical infrastructure, the very systems Volt Typhoon is targeting right now.
So what do we do about that?
That's the question policymakers have to tackle next. How do you manage the existential risk from this existing code base? You can mandate memory-safe code for tomorrow, but what about the millions of lines of C and C++ running today's water treatment plant? This massive cleanup effort has to move beyond just voluntary measures, especially if political instability keeps threatening the agencies that are supposed to be guiding it.
That feels like the next deep dive for us. How do we pay off decades of technical debt without collapsing the system it supports? In the meantime, for you listening, what's the one core actionable takeaway from all of this?
CISA's Secure Our World campaign really distills it down to 4 basic steps. And they estimate these 4 things can prevent 98% of all cyber attacks.
Okay, what are they?
Use multi-factor authentication everywhere you possibly can. Use strong, unique passwords with a password manager. Keep your software updated immediately. And learn to recognize and report phishing attempts. Do those 4 things, and you are contributing directly to our collective defense and national resilience.